Well, good morning, everybody. I want to welcome you here to the U.S. Institute of Peace. My name is Kathleen Keenest. I'm the director of the Gender Policy and Strategy program here. For those of you who are new to USIP, it was founded in 1984. Congress as an independent national institute dedicated to the proposition that peace is possible, practical, and essential for U.S. and global security. We pursue this vision of a world without violent conflict by working on the ground with local partners. We provide people, organizations, and governments with the tools, knowledge, and training to manage conflict so it doesn't become violent and resolve it when it does. USIP is in the 8th year of dedicated programming on gender and peace. And much of this work has focused on advancing women's participation in peace-building activities, including efforts to counter violent extremism in Nigeria, promoting community dialogues in South Sudan, to name just a few. This month, in fact, on March 1st, we began a month-long series of events in celebration of National Women's History Month. We had one a week ago on When Women in War Aren't Victims Security Blind Spot, and today is our second. After war, gender equality needs investment too. So we hope that you'll join us later in the month as well as we do a program on women in Ukraine, the revolution of dignity, March 30th, Stuck in the Man Box, Young Men and Identity, and the last one in the series, the effect of gender in mediating on violent conflict, particularly focused on Colombia. So today we have a distinguished group of experts here for a discussion around the importance of full and meaningful participation of gender in our peace processes, and especially greater awareness about the areas that we often quite blind to, and that's the economic empowerment, not just on the ground, but in our institutional processes. And I'm very pleased to say that we have gathered a remarkable group who is going to both educate us, I'm going to be educated here a lot, and also inform us in terms of what it really looks like, this gender financing. So I'm going to begin with introducing the panelists and our moderator, and then get us started. So on my direct left is Carol Cohn. She's the founding director of the Consortium on Gender, Security, and Human Rights. I think many of us are well aware of Carol's long-term research, including one of her more recent books, Women in Wars, and she is somebody who really is connecting the dots between security, peace building, and this morning, economics. So welcome, Carol. On Carol's left is Tom Shearer, who is a program officer here in the Economics and Peace Building at USIP. He has focused a lot of his research on the dynamics of war, especially in relation to economics and resource scarcity. He recently finished his PhD in politics from Princeton University, where he specialized in international relations and formal and quantitative methods. His dissertation, Peace for Keeps, examines how host governments use UN peacekeeping operations not to create peace, but rather to stay in power. We'll be looking for a book soon, right? And on Tom's left is Janet Stotsky, economist and visiting scholar, International Monetary Fund. She is currently an independent consultant on fiscal policies and gender, but she was an economist with the IMF for 21 years, where she held managerial positions in fiscal affairs and African departments and in the Office of Budget and Planning. She is widely published on public finance, gender, and macroeconomic issues. She has a PhD from Stanford in economics and a BA in economics from Princeton University. And our panel moderator today is no stranger to the issues of gender equality and women's empowerment. Carla Capel is our Vice President for the Center for Applied Conflict Transformation here at the Institute of Peace. But previously, she was the Chief Strategy Officer at the U.S. Agency for International Development, as well as the very first Senior Coordinator for Gender Equality and Women's Empowerment. Carla has an MA in Public Policy from Harvard's University Kennedy School of Government, and her bachelor's degree is from Cornell University. So it is my pleasure to turn the program over to Carla and to get this discussion moving. Thanks so much, all of you, for joining us today, and the audience and those of you who are online. I want you to know we are tweeting this morning at USIP Gender, and for those of you who are here, there are Twitter handles on your bios. Carla.
Thank you, Kathleen, and good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here during this month with all of you, and particularly with this panel and on this topic. One of the things that is particularly exciting to me is often we have discussions related to women, peace, and security, and then we have discussions related to the economics of gender equality. But rarely is there a conversation really about the intersection of the two and its importance. And so the opportunity really to dig into that conversation and to get a sense of really the state of play on how we draw connections, understand the connecting points, and really think about how to carry forward the agenda is a really important one, and one that receives insufficient attention. What we're going to do is start off particularly with presentations from Carol, and then I'm going to use Tom a little bit as the foil or the discussant to kick off what I hope will be an animated conversation in an area which is a relatively new area of inquiry. And then we will have a conversation with all of you because we're eager to get your wisdom and your observations. But we thought it would be useful for us to frame that conversation. So with that, I'm going to turn first to Carol to frame those intersection points and really give us that context through which to look at this issue and carry forward the conversation. So please.
Thank you. So thank you so much, Carla, Kathleen, Danielle, for getting me here, and for all of you for attending. I have to say it's wonderful and sadly unique to be in an institution that believes peace is possible, practical, and essential. Dr. Janet Stotsky and I are going to be differently talking about some of the ideas that were discussed in a recent knowledge-building workshop that was organized by the consortium and our Norwegian partners, NOREF, in Oslo in January. And the first thing I want to say is that that workshop, which was on gender, public finance, and peace building, was part of a larger project. The larger project, which comes out of the consortium, is known as the Feminist Roadmap for Sustainable Peace. So I'll take a few, and the entire Feminist Roadmap project is in fact about economic issues in relation to peace building. So I'm going to take a few minutes to talk about that project to contextualize this, and then talk a little bit about gender, public finance, and peace building. One of the reasons that we started this project, one way to think about the reason that we started this project is to think about two different things. One of them is the failures of peace building. We all know the horrifying numbers of conflicts which, within 10 years after a peace agreement have ended up back where countries have ended up back at war. And there's, I think, in general, a lot of concern about whether our models of peace building are actually effective. And the other issue is the women, peace, and security agenda. It's 16 years plus since the Resolution 1325 was passed. Despite Herculean efforts by people, everything from women in conflict-affected areas, women in policy institutions, to women who work in research and in education institutions, not very much has changed, or certainly not as much as we would hope. And most crucially, for what we're talking about today, post-war reconstruction efforts have largely continued to deepen rather than ameliorate gendered structural inequalities. So why is that? And can we, by bringing feminist gendered analysis, do anything that could actually radically transform our models of peace building? So that's, and if you think about why not that much has changed in relation to post-war reconstruction, one way to think about it, and I think this is something that came out in the Secretary General's global study to mark the 15-year anniversary of 1325, one way to think about it is just to look at the funding and say, despite the fact that the Secretary General's 7-point plan of action said that 15% of funding to fragile states should be earmarked for gender equality, the study found that no more than 2% has been. So certainly, continued rhetorical commitment, continually backed up by not that much financial commitment. But I think that there's another way to think. I think that way is important, but I think there's another way that it has to be thought about as well, which is that we can't continue to think about gender equality as a separate series of programs and initiatives, things that often get called around women's issues, as they're called. When it is thought about as a separate series of programs and initiatives, they are inevitably small. They are almost inevitably not quite seen as important enough. Oh, we have to address the urgent stuff first, and we can deal with these things later. And instead of thinking about gender equality in relation to a series of programs or initiatives, we need to be understanding that all of the processes that are part of post-conflict reconstruction and peace building are themselves gendered. They have deeply gendered effects. They have the possibility of leaving gendered and other structural inequalities in place, or of actually deepening them or transforming them. So we need to be looking at all of those projects and the ways in which they are gendered in order to actually have an impact on gender equality. What kinds of decisions am I talking about, or processes am I talking about? Decisions about how infrastructure is rebuilt, whether you're talking about roads, bridges, mobility, energy, water. The decisions that get made about how to do this will affect the possibilities for women's livelihoods. They will affect women's care burdens. They will affect how they spend their time, whether or not they are physically secure, whether or not they even have the time to participate in political and economic life. So infrastructure reconstruction, which is usually seen as a technical, urgent thing that happens prior to gender, has to be thoroughly gender analyzed. What other kinds of things? Decisions about natural resource exploitation, extractive industries, right? Mining, timber, gas, land reform, and decisions about land acquisition, land accession, agricultural policies, trade relations, monetary policy. All of these are the kinds of post-conflict reconstruction processes that we have to be looking at. Now, I would say the critical thing about each of the processes that I've mentioned is that they tend to be thought about either as technical issues or at least as issues that have their own logics that have nothing to do with gender, right? Building a road, that has nothing to do with gender. We know how to build a road. Or we know what trade policy should be, or we know how to, lay water pipes. But actually, as I say, each one of these, and if we had a lot more time, I could talk more about it, have deeply gendered effects. So think about this now in relationship to the Women, Peace, and Security agenda. One of the things that we assume with the Women, Peace, and Security agenda is that if you get women into peace processes, you will have provisions in those peace agreements that safeguard women's rights, women's human rights, that create structures for political participation that are more inclusive. And it is possible, if you have participation, to get these things into peace agreements. But then our concern, and the concern that leads to this project, is that those very processes that I was just describing as the sort of more thought of as the more technical post-conflict reconstruction processes can actually undermine any of those rights that you have managed, any of those transformative provisions that you have managed to get in your peace agreement and your post-conflict government. So let me give you an example. I've been talking pretty abstractly. I know that you all know that during the long civil war in Guatemala, Mayan north of Guatemala were repeatedly the victims of sexual violence at the hands of the Guatemalan state military. What some of you probably also know is that more than 2 decades later, women in those same communities, those same Mayan communities in northern Guatemala, were victims of sexual violence again at the hands of state military, civilian police, and private military contractors who were acting at the behest of the Guatemalan Nickel Company, which was in turn a subsidiary of a Canadian mining company. Okay, so the most obvious target of the Women, Peace, and Security agenda, sexual violence and armed conflict, coming up again years later at the hands of militarized actors, but not as part of the war, as part of the economic activity, right? As part of mining nickel. There is, by the way, a really great book about this by Luz Mendez and a colleague. You can get it in Spanish from Amazon, or you can download an English version for free from our website, if you like. So in addition to a horrible injustice for these women, this is also an example of the ways in which, if we are not thinking about things like mineral rights and who gets what kind of contracts with what kinds of provisions to exploit them, we are not dealing with, not only are we not dealing with women's security, but we're also we can be losing the transformative effects of the provisions that we have fought so hard for in peace agreements. So the roadmap itself identifies what are all of these different processes that tend to occur in post-conflict settings. It does gendered analysis of how do they usually occur, who are the actors, where is the decision taking place, and then tries to come up with an alternative set of policies that everybody from people in policy institutions, international actors who are participating in peace processes, to local women's organizations who are advocating on the ground could be advocating for. So it's, if you're thinking about women at the peace table, this is a very sort of forward-looking, what are the kinds of issues, the economic issues that you really need to be engaged in and knowledgeable about in order for the rights issues that you have been fighting for to actually have a material basis and to not be undermined. Okay, so that is the roadmap. Now, where does public finance come into it? Well, public finance is one of the topics that we're trying to look at in this roadmap for sustainable peace. And again, I can talk about the other topics later if you're interested. Why are we so in public finance? Well, as I know all of you here know, there is a lot to fund at a war, right? That if you are concerned about building peace, you not only have the provisions of the peace agreement that need to be funded, and here, in fact, many great peace agreements flounder, right? You get really good provisions in them, but they don't get funded. One of our colleagues who was at this meeting, James Boyce, talked about in El Salvador how the part of the agreement was to have a new national civilian police that was to take over for the corrupt militaries police that existed before, and also a land transfer program that was supposed to, it wasn't land reform, but it was essentially an arms for land program. Both of these would be key to building real security on the ground for women, for men in the country. Neither one was funded. And if they're funded, what happens to your possibilities, not only of having physical security, but also transforming society in peaceful ways such that your peace can actually be sustained? So the provisions of the peace agreement need to be funded. You have all these things like disarmament, demobilization, security sector reform, transitional justice. All of these require funding. The reconstruction of the country's institutions, of its infrastructure. and also the programs that could lead to transformations of the underlying inequalities that were part of driving the conflict in the first place. But too often you have these sort of peace-building ideas over here, and you have macroeconomic policy over here. And the kinds of macroeconomic decision-making that's occurring is occurring on a completely different track from the peace-building conversations. And very often, not only is it not supporting the peace-building conversations per se, but it also actually may be undermining it. And again, we could talk about examples of that. So the question is, how do you bring these two together? Public finance, peace-building, and how do you do it in a way where you are bringing gender analysis in throughout every step of the way? How every single decision that you're making here, you're thinking about its impacts on men and women differently. Now, what about public finance? Well, when you fund post-conflict reconstruction, not all of the funding comes from the state, right? We know that some of it is coming from private economic actors, some of it's coming from NGOs, and so on, but a lot of it goes through the state. And it's important for it to go through the state because if part of building a sustainable peace is having people think that their state is legitimate, part of why they think their state is legitimate is because it provides services. It, keeps its promises and provides services. So public finance, that means we're talking about finance that goes through the state, and public finance is usually thought of as having three different elements. The collection of revenue, right? You need the money to do it, and you can be getting the revenue from internal sources, such as taxation, or external sources, such as loans and other kinds of aid, whether it's coming from international development banks or bilateral donors, other mechanisms. So raising money externally and raising it internally, and of course, this is one of the things I think Janet will talk about, but how you do that, and especially, you can have a tax system that tends toward more gender equality or less gender equality. You can have conditions that come with loans that actually support gender equality or that undermine it. So the first one is collection of revenue. The second one is allocation of resources through the budget process. Budget processes are processes through which you decide what you're going to spend money on, how it's going to be used, how you allocate funds. And the third is the management of those expenditures. So I think the last thing I'll say here, and Janet will talk a lot more about these processes, is that, of course, at the end of a conflict, there is usually a large influx of funds. It doesn't last that long, right? Maybe 10 years at the max. So it's really a critical time at which there are the resources available, again, to either transform things for the better or for the worse. We believe that it is an obligation of states under CEDAW to actually be using these funds for greater gender equality. Most of the funds right now are used, gender equality funds are used for women's programs in health, education, and social services. Virtually none of them are allocated in the largest reconstruction budget lines, which, of course, what's the largest one? It's always security. But also economic recovery, infrastructure development. So that's our challenge, is how do you actually think about each of those rather than projects for women in ways that will transform gender relations. So, Janet, it all, right?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Carol. As you were talking, I was thinking about one of the things I did was I attended the first and second donor conferences in the signature of the Comprehensive Peace Agreement in what was Sudan, now Sudan and South Sudan. And so I went to the first donor conference, both were in Oslo, and they presented the needs and the data analysis that had been done mostly by multilateral institutions on where there were gaps in access and health and education and all these different areas, and then talking about where the allocation of post-conflict, the harvest of resources post-conflict should go. The CPA had been signed, and then I went back, I don't know, 5 to 10 ish, maybe it was 3 to 5-ish years later, to the second donor conference, and they went through the same exercise, except that none of the indicators had moved because the resources weren't actually allocated to close the gaps in terms of health or education or anything else. And so you had this, what felt to me like a pantomime exercise, where you were talking about what they were, but then the allocation of the resources wasn't actually targeting those needs in ways that you could start to see a trajectory that indicated there would be any real progress. And it was very frustrating to watch that.
And
So.
totally outside of how we think in the Women, Peace, and Security agenda, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it doesn't touch. Carol and I go way back working on women, peace, and security, and we basically didn't talk about these within that construct. But more on that later. We're going to turn now to Dr. Janet Skotsky, who's going to give us a frame for looking at this with regard to gender budgeting. Take it away.
I'm going to just stand up there.
Yeah,
I can't read my own PowerPoint.
You can't sit here like
Then I think it's in our interest to allow that.
No.
Okay. Yeah, so hopefully you can see that, and I can read here. Okay. Good morning. Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and I'd like to thank the U.S. Institute of Peace for inviting me. It's a pleasure to speak on this very important topic, and also to thank Carol for including me in her project, which brings together these really important issues, as both of you have pointed out, both Carol and Carla, in the introduction, the overview, and the comments you were making now, how important it is to bring together these issues of peace, security, gender, and paying for it. So my topic is gender budgeting, and I approached this as a head of a project that was led through the IMF, but paid for by the United Kingdom's Department for International Development. And we were looking at this from the point of view of integrating gender into the public budgeting process. So we weren't looking at this from the point of view of peace and security. And the idea that Carol had by bringing me into her project was to try to bring these ideas together and give them more substance. So hopefully that this will stimulate your thinking and give more precise framing and methodology to the idea of the part of this agenda. So I encourage you to think about that as I go through this presentation, which really doesn't deal with the issue of peace and security, but as you'll see, it's the idea of how you achieve gender-related objectives through the budget. And some of those objectives, importantly, should be those related to peace and security. But those weren't the focus of our project. We were thinking more of the kind of traditional issues that the IMF might deal with in its work with developing countries, healthcare, education, and so forth, which are related to the peace and security agenda, as you might know, because having these kind of public services is, of course, essential to having functioning governments that have legitimacy and which solidify peace on the ground and the idea of a government. So you can see how there is an important connection between all these things, but that wasn't our focus. Now, my presentation today doesn't focus on issues of revenue, but I'll be happy to address those issues in the question and answer period. Also, the presentation doesn't focus on issues of what the IMF is doing on its gender and macro agenda and how it's trying to integrate gender into its agenda. So, although I'm retired from the IMF, I'm working there as a visiting scholar, but I'll be happy to answer any questions you might have as to how the IMF is trying to integrate this for itself, a relatively new area of work, into both its research and operational work. Okay, so let me take a few minutes to talk about the idea of gender budgeting. How many of you have heard of this idea before? A few of you. Okay, so as you might know, if you've been reading through this literature, it has a lot of different definitions, but I'd like to give you my idea of it and also to put it in the framework of economics so that you see how it can be dealt with as an issue of economics and public budgeting. So gender budgeting, it's the use of fiscal policy and administration to promote gender equality and girls' and women's development. So that's a very general definition and encompasses many things, but it's one that you can see fits into the economist's idea of something that should be used and integrated into fiscal policy. So it's just saying that you bring into fiscal policy and administration the idea of your gender-related objectives and how you can achieve them through the budgeting process. And I'd like to emphasize it's been generally applied at the national level. So there's maybe some 80 to 100 countries in the world that have tried something called gender budgeting. But there are also many other countries that haven't done something called gender budgeting, but have still tried to achieve gender equality objectives through the budget. So It's a terminology, it's jargon, but yet it has substance. And there are countries that don't use this terminology, but yet still try to achieve the same substantive results. So that's one important point I'd like you to start with. But another important point is that it isn't only something that happens at the level of the national government. It can be something that's done at the level of the state and at a local government. So in many countries, especially larger ones, a country like the United States, a large one with very important state and local governments, but also in the developing world, many state governments, let's say in India or anywhere in Latin America, even in Africa today, you have the devolution of responsibilities to lower levels of government. State and local governments provide important public services. So this should be seen as a responsibility for something even those levels of government should be taking on. And in the examples I'll give later, I'll point out how governments that are really trying to take this kind of initiative seriously apply this not only at the national, but at every level of government where important public services, especially health, education, and infrastructure, are being delivered. Now, gender budgeting should be aligned with national development goals on gender equality and women's development. It seems pretty obvious, but that connection is not always made. But that should be the starting point. You should align what you're doing in your budget to your national development goals. Now, where governments then often fall short is after setting national development goals with respect to gender, they fail to integrate them into the budget. And that's why gender budgeting is so important. And as Carol was making the point, and as Carla was then making the point, if you don't give them any money, nothing gets done. And while that might seem very simple, it's actually very complicated to make a reality. And that's why gender budgeting is important. Bring the importance of not just setting these goals in your national development plans, but making sure that they're integrated into budgets. And not just national budgets, but budgets at every level of government where you have important public services being delivered. And finally, because I know there's always a lot of pushback, maybe not in this audience today, but in general, the idea that gender budgeting is somehow a zero-sum game, that you're going to spend more money on women, that means you're going to spend less on men. Gender budgeting is not all about just taking money from the budget to give to women's programs. It's about spending money better to achieve national development goals that will benefit your whole society. It's not a zero-sum game, and it's not just about reallocating money in the budget to benefit some at the expense of others. Gender budgeting should address any valid national development goals that will benefit your whole society. And it can also address goals related to boys and men. For instance, recently, looking at the gender budgeting program of the Austrian government, a developed country, which has a very well-developed gender budgeting program. And their gender budgeting program identified some very important goals with respect to women, domestic violence, which is a growing problem in Austria, and things related to men, which involved road fatalities among young men and older men's health needs. So gender budgeting for them involved both identifying the needs of women as well as the needs of men. So it shouldn't be seen as something that's only women-specific, although most of the people who have been proponents of it and have worked on it in the developing country context where they saw the underdevelopment of women's needs as essential and an important part to bring about. But in the developed country context, also many women's needs are still unmet, but there also may be very valid needs in both developing and countries for boys and men, and they should be brought into this framework as well. So I want to emphasize that. It's about gender, not just about women, and it's not a zero-sum game. Okay, so let me turn to the next. Let me make this concrete for you. What are some examples of gender budgeting goals so that you have an idea of what countries that are doing this kind of initiative are trying to achieve? So in developing countries, today, it's a really impressive achievement that primary education, females' access to primary education is almost equal to boys, girls and boys. In some parts of populations of the poorest countries, that's not the case. And still there's an issue of quality. But that Millennium Development Goal is almost achieved, one of the few that actually came close to being met. So that's still an aspirational goal, but at the level of secondary education, it's still not met in many of the countries of the world, especially the poorest. So one important goal of many gender budgeting programs in the poorest countries, but also in other middle-income countries, is to equalize female access to education. And what does this mean? Well, this means building more schools. It means ensuring that in secondary schools, you have proper hygienic facilities for adolescent girls, that you have running water. This is an important issue, as we'll see when I provide some examples from African countries, that these are important infrastructure kind of spending that you have to achieve equal access to education at that level in your school systems. Another area is health. This is an important area where still you don't have equality to the basic health needs of women and girls, especially in developing countries and especially the poorest countries. So that's another area where gender budgeting has been applied. And some of these health needs, like maternal health needs, of course, are unique to women, but still you can bring that under the idea of gender equality and women's development if you broaden the idea to be not just equality, but women's development for the countries that are, of course, unique to women, like bearing children. Another important area for gender budgeting would be things like reducing the unpaid time demands on women and girls through improved infrastructure. So one of the little less paid parts of women's burden is the demand of them on the unpaid time demands, bearing water, fetching water and bringing it to households, which can be an all-day time-consuming demand in many parts of the world which are water poor and where the infrastructure is poor, or taking care of younger siblings, things that cooking, which is also a very time-consuming thing where you have no electricity and you have little access to fuel, so you have to collect that fuel. These are all things that I know, for instance, that USAID and others have been working with countries on improving access to these things, all of which reduce the unpaid time demands on women and girls, and which give them the opportunity not only to go to school, but to engage in market labor and paid labor. So all of these things can be part of your gender budgeting program. They should be part of the way you evaluate the value of public programs and public infrastructure. You should make sure when you look at the benefits spending, you don't neglect the benefits you have reducing those unpaid time demands, which is often ignored, but an important component of the benefits of these public expenditures. Another area for gender budgeting is addressing women's lack of economic opportunity and ways in which public subsidies, either through the spending side or through the tax side, can be used to generate more economic opportunity for women, not just through improving their human capital through education and good health care, but also through various kinds of programs, either on the side of stimulating demand for their labor through subsidies or tax breaks to businesses, or through direct subsidies and tax breaks to women to stimulate the supply of their labor, or ways to overcome biases. All of these things can be built in through the budget. As I said, tax policies are another way you can approach it, not just through the spending side, but reforming your basic structure of your income tax. So quite a few income taxes have been restructured with the goal of making them more friendly to what's called second earners, reducing that higher effective tax rate on second earners, which are generally considered to be women in many countries. So many countries over time, especially in Europe, for instance, went from a joint tax system to a single filing tax system, which was believed to be more neutral to second earners. So that's a big topic. We could spend the rest of the day talking about it, so I'm only going to mention that in passing, but that's also can be a part of gender budgeting initiatives. And finally, there's an important point, which is collecting the relevant data. Have to build their capacity to collect gender disaggregated data, but not only gender disaggregated data, but data that's on the household, which often can't be disaggregated by data because it's only collected at the household level, but gives you insight into the kind of responsibilities that people in the household have, and where you get some assessment, for instance, of the unpaid time demand. So all of this is important for doing the right kind of analytics that support good public policy. So I'm going to go through the rest of this presentation very quickly, but you have the slides. They were handed out at the beginning so that you can follow up. And also at the end, there's some references to the IMF website where you can find all the working papers that came out of this. And I'll just mention the papers so that whatever you're interested in, you can look for it. Or you can always get in touch with me if you want to, and I'll send you the papers. But there were 9 papers that came out of this project. So one is an overview paper. It's basically laying out the fiscal framework. And I authored that, and the website will be at the end of this presentation. It's laying out the public finance, the economic framework for this whole idea of gender budgeting. It's trying to put it in the framework that an economist could understand and respect, the idea of trying to give this a respect in the sense of an economist's viewpoint. Then the idea was to draw upon examples from each of the regions of the world, bring those in and show how gender budgeting was applied and some of the administrative aspects. So that's in the overview paper. So that's the shortest and most compact introduction. Then there were 6 regional papers that focused on different regions in the world. And what we tried to do, and these are the 6 regions we use, basically the way that we divide things in the IMF, our work program, Asia, Europe, Middle East and Central Asia, Pacific and Caribbean islands, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Western Hemisphere. We picked the countries in each region that seemed to have the most significant initiative. So by significant, we're not necessarily saying it was the best, the greatest, because we had a hard time assessing effectiveness, but one which we thought was significant in the sense we thought it had actually accomplished something. In the sense that many of these initiatives we didn't think had gone very far. We felt that they had kind of run out of steam. And the idea of this project was to try to extract the lessons from the countries that had accomplished something as a way of saying what it is that makes them successful, as a way of making more of these move forward and succeed. So these are the examples of the countries we thought had done the most. So in Asia, for instance, Australia, India, the Philippines, Bangladesh, and the Republic of Korea, and so on. And I would just focus on Rwanda and Uganda because that was the paper I wrote, and the ones where I had two very interesting examples of countries that had really made this initiative work. And in the case of Rwanda, a post-conflict country, so one that made this initiative work under very trying and difficult circumstances. Then there were two other papers, one which looked at trends, just basic trends in gender equality, and then a final one which looked at trying to measure the effectiveness of gender budgeting, which there's really been very little actual evaluation using data, and that was using Indian states. So we made use of the fact that not only in India do you have a national level initiative, you have state governments, which in India are quite large. The largest state in India is larger than most countries in the world. So you had state governments implementing this initiative at different points in time. So you had a very rich panel data set where you could use that to assess the differences between the states and how they'd implemented the initiative. And we found a very interesting result, which was that the states that had implemented this initiative well had done better in terms of achieving more equality in primary education than those that hadn't, and that rising levels of income were not sufficient to bring about equality in education, that there was something extra that was needed, and that could be contributed by something like an initiative like gender budgeting. So that we thought was a very interesting result. Sometimes people think that as long as a country develops, gender equality will just come about as a byproduct. What our finding was that wasn't sufficient, and which other people have found. So that was an interesting confirmation of that result. So those are all the papers. You'll find them on the website. And since I know I don't have too much time, I'm just going to focus on Sub-Saharan Africa and the example of Rwanda, because I thought Rwanda was an example of a country that did a lot of the right things, as I said, under very difficult circumstances. As you know, it's a post-conflict country, and was able to show that this isn't rocket science. It's something that a serious government that really is intent on achieving a certain degree of gender equality can make progress. Okay, so what did Rwanda do? Well, first of all, it enacted an organic budget law. So an organic budget law is basically saying a law that governs the way the budget is done. And it's not as serious in some sense as a constitution, but it's more serious than, let's say, your annual appropriations law. So it's somewhere in between in terms of the spectrum of laws. And it incorporated gender budgeting formally into this law, okay? And it made gender budget statements mandatory. And that was building upon the example of Austria, as I said, which was an example from a developed country that also seemed to take this notion of gender budgeting very seriously. So by doing this, it was after a number of years of trying and not succeeding with its initiative, in 2012-13 was basically saying we're going to put this into law, which means that this is something the Minister of Finance has to take seriously because it is part of the budget law. And so it's in a sense saying no matter who the Minister of Finance is, the Minister of Finance must obey the law, and therefore this is now in the law. It must be part of the work of the Ministry of Finance. And that's the most important thing that we found in terms of success. It might seem obvious to you that in the terms of the budget, the Minister of Finance, the Ministry of Finance must be involved. But that wasn't always the case with many of the initiatives, and that was one of the reasons we found that they didn't move very far. If you put parts of the budget in women and children's ministries or things like that, it's helpful in terms of understanding the issues. But if you want something to happen in the budget, if you want money to be appropriated, you have to assign responsibility to where things happen, and that's the Ministry of Finance. So what we found in our survey of countries, and what was the case in Rwanda, is that the Ministry of Finance and the minister in particular, whoever that person is, has to take the lead and then has to assign responsibilities. And I'm focusing on spending here, but also you can apply this to the tax side. Has responsibility to each of the spending ministries: health, education, infrastructure, the responsibility for identifying an objective, a gender-related objective that's important to their area of responsibility, and then finding programs within their purview and making sure that money is allocated to them in the budget. It's very critical, and it's, again, as I said, an important component of the budgeting process and must be led from this approach if you wanted to actually have results. Now, what was very interesting also about Rwanda, and which was unusual, was that Rwanda was at the same time undergoing a reform of its public financial management system. So a number of countries in the world, both in the developed and the developing world, have tried to put in place something called program or results-based budgeting. Some of you who work on budgeting issues might be with this. It's the idea of moving away from line item budgeting, where you look at budgeting from only what you spend on things to actually what you get from public services outcomes. So you divide the budget into programs and outcomes that you expect to get from that budget, rather than just focusing on the inputs or the amounts you spend, okay? So that's a very short way of that. But Rwanda was trying to move from a very traditional form of budgeting based on line items and focusing on spending to one focused on outputs or outcomes. And they integrated their gender budgeting into this public financial management reform. And so that what was to me very interesting was that they assured that there should be an exact coherence between the way they were dividing the budget into programs and their gender budgeting initiative, so that they would be able to see that they were exactly lining up their objectives with their programs, that they could then monitor and evaluate the outcomes. So they started with 4 pilot ministries: education, health, agriculture, and infrastructure. And again, what was interesting here was that they didn't limit it only to the social sectors, education and health, but added in agriculture and infrastructure, which were economic sectors. They saw the importance of both having social and economic objectives for gender equality. They extended it to the national government and then eventually to the subnational. So again, they saw the importance of having it at every level of government. And then the final thing that they did, which I thought was very important, was they established something called a Gender Monitoring Office. So those of you who work in government know that evaluating your outcomes and having an independent scrutiny of government programs is important in the end, someone who evaluates the outcomes and is independent of the entity itself. So what they set up was an office to evaluate the outcome of gender budgeting and to write a report each year. And that I thought was very innovative, because almost no other country in the world did something like this in such a formal way. And finally, they engaged their civil and research community. And there were various articles written, which again was very helpful in writing my own analysis, to be able to draw upon their own research and analysis of data. So altogether, a very nice way, as I said, something that almost any country in the world would be capable of doing and show the seriousness. And I just bring here an example of accountability, and I won't take too much longer because I want to leave time for Thomas and questions. But here's an example from their gender monitoring report. So they have ministries and districts. Districts are the local level. So they're evaluating themselves on the basis, do they select sub-programs that are service delivery in nature and have a big budget? So they're giving themselves pretty high marks, 85 and 73%. Then they're saying, were they backed by comprehensive gender analysis with sex disaggregated data? So at the ministry level, federal level, in other words, no, 7%, low evaluation. At the district level, they gave themselves a higher evaluation, half of them were. And then, did the programs have clear linkages with outputs, indicators, targets, and activities? In both cases, a pretty low evaluation. So in other words, they're actually being very critical of themselves and saying, we tried, but we haven't done very well so far. So not only are they trying, which is unusual, but they're actually being very critical of themselves, which is even more impressive. So I won't go through any of the other examples because I don't want to take up any more time, but you have the handout and you also can read the papers. And at the end of my presentation, which again, I don't want to take up too much time, I just want to say there were some lessons that we learned, and I will very quickly go through key ones. So as I said, many countries in the world have implemented gender budgeting, but we shouldn't limit our analysis to those countries, because some countries try to adopt gender-related objectives through the budget. They just don't call their initiatives gender budgeting. A few countries have been successful. For instance, as I cited, Austria and Rwanda were 2 countries that I think deserve special recognition for the success of their efforts. Keys to success: the leadership of the Ministry of Finance is critical. Ministries' departments must identify important and achievable objectives consistent with their national development goals. Government must adopt policies that are consistent with these goals and then fund the budget. Subnational governments are important, especially where they play an important role in providing public services. International organizations, UN Women being the most in this area, can provide important technical and financial support. NGOs, academic scholarship and advocacy, all can play a catalytic role. And nonetheless, government involvement is ultimately the only thing that assures success. You can't do this without the involvement of government. Sometimes countries have kept their initiatives alive through an active NGO community, but you can't achieve anything without the government being on board. Monitoring of outcomes and evaluation are essential, and collection of appropriate data and use in supporting analysis is critical. For low-income countries, education and healthcare are still important objectives. They shouldn't be ignored, even though in some areas important progress has been made. Electricity, water supply, cooking technologies, these are still important areas of infrastructure for low-income countries, and where unpaid time demands of women and girls are still very important. And this is an important part of the benefits that should be taken into account when assessing the infrastructure that governments should put in place. I think this is one of the key things that gender budgeting can bring to that process. In addition to that, you can look at other areas with the economy where women can be more productive and contribute more fully. In the lowest income countries, agriculture is still important and women still play an important role. So that's an area where one should look at it. For instance, in the case of Ethiopia, they looked at the equal access of women farmers to knowledge and training and inputs as an important part of their gender budgeting initiative. There's also areas that are complementary to gender budgeting, not only in tax, which can be brought in as budget, but financial, civil, and other laws, women's right to property, and other things. Also, there's an important aspect I didn't talk about, which is improving the administration of justice, law, and order to reduce violence. This was an important part of the gender budgeting initiative of many of the countries, just the funding of the administration of justice. So not the direct service delivery, but the funding to make sure that the administration of justice, violence against women was taken into account and properly funded. And then there's a different set of issues that might apply to more developed countries if you were looking at those, things related to, let's say, social insurance programs and so on for older women, but I won't talk about those at the moment. The last set are some of the websites, but as I said, if you like anything, you don't find it easily on the IMF web, you can just get in touch with me and I'll be happy to send it to you.
Great, thank you so much. Very rich presentation of the analysis that IMF and others have done. Tom, you come from an interesting intersection point, having been focused on economics of peace building and working on peacekeeping. What are some thoughts you can bring based on the presentations we've heard this morning?
Thank you, everyone. It's an honor to be on this panel, and thank you, Kathleen, for putting this together and all the other events. So this is fascinating. I'll be brief because I know there's a lot of people in here with better experiences, more interesting experiences than I, but for me, this was a topic that initially, as in last Friday, I wasn't really sure how to really get a handle on it, and now reaching to the examples, it's become very clear that these are things that we see all the time, and that we just haven't had a good way to connect them or to frame them, a kind of umbrella for them. So while Kathleen's already hectored me about my book project, I'm excited for this book project also to come out, because I think it pulls together a bunch of things that we don't really know how to talk about. And then I'll also say in my brief involvement in government work right now, I've realized quickly that budgets and contracts are everything. And so that it only follows that a gender-focused mindset has to start at that higher level. There's 2 points I'll raise quickly. One is just to echo, I think there's a really big question here about conflict can raise, what's the word? Can really bring some gender norms into, bring them out, so to speak. That the conflict masculinity literature is quite strong, and there's a big question about when people are working in conflict. So I'm thinking about project in Afghanistan. How do you work within that structure and work with the existing hierarchies to say win hearts and minds or support infrastructure projects? How do you work within those hierarchies without reinforcing them to a degree that that we might not want. So to put that another way, I think there's a really big question about do you support the institutions as they are with all their faults, or do you sometimes go around an institution so that you can pursue policy that might take into account dynamics in a more productive way? And I think that's a question, maybe that's very specific to certain contexts, but that's a question I'd be very interested in thinking about more, and I don't have an answer to. One other personal anecdote that I'll just say is from where this intersection has come up. So part of my work here at the U.S. Institute of Peace, we have a research project in Afghanistan supported by the Minerva Research Initiative, and the question that they were curious for us was how do firms and businesses adapt to insecurity and conflict environments? Is a pretty interesting question for a couple levels. One might think, or one reason is we're trying to do a lot of job support or business support in these contexts, so we should know a little bit more about how they're operating. And the gender dynamics we hadn't thought a lot about on the front end besides what we all kind of know about Afghanistan. During some interviews over there with some business owners, it was very interesting to ask the question, what types of violence affect your business? And we heard some of the things you might expect, that road banditry or the ability to move goods affected my business, or government corruption was a major issue. And I was fortunate to talk to one female business owner, and she brought, when you asked what type of violence most affected her, it was the street harassment, just going down to the market, down the road. And it clicked that this was crucial for our analysis of how businesses adapt to insecurity, because we won't see female-led or businesses with more female employees, we won't see them adapting to the types of insecurity that we're looking at in terms of insurgency, because they're already adapted to an insecurity that is almost everywhere and all the time for them. So without taking that component into the analysis of how these different businesses are adapting, we would have totally missed that aspect. So I think that's one place where the intersection between insecurity, gender, and international intervention or attempts to support this work really came out to me.
Thanks. I think often those, as you were talking, often those stories are what really drives home what the practical implications are of the decisions that are made with regard to the flow of resources. So I really appreciate that. I was thinking, and I know some of you in the room have had an opportunity to hear Ambassador Don Steinberg, who is the former U.S. ambassador to Angola, tells a story about post-conflict peace agreement implementation in Angola, where he discusses the fact that resources were allocated for demining that were focused on demining along roadways. And they wanted to do that because they wanted to get economic activity back flowing across the country. But the unintended consequence was they didn't allocate resources to demining in fields and agricultural lands. And as a result, you had women disproportionately affected by mines exploding and the ordnance blowing up because there hadn't been resources, financial resources allocated to demine in the areas where women were going, as opposed to the areas, the truck routes, and where men were particularly employed. And it's a horrible story about the lack of a gender perspective in a post-conflict. But it really drives home why it's important to allocate resources in certain ways, to bearing in mind the different ways in which men and women move within their societies post-conflict. And I was thinking as you were talking, Tom, about a similar example when I was at USAID. We were talking about the spread of HIV and AIDS, and this was true in conflict and non-conflict countries. You looked at the differentiated way AIDS infections spread for men and for women, and that the allocation of those resources had towards HIV/AIDS prevention and treatment were very different depending on if you were looking along truck routes, isolated communities, et cetera, and whether they were spreading to sex workers along those routes, whether they were in isolated communities where you didn't have primary, secondary, tertiary health care, with important implications for the economic well-being of those countries in the decade and decades following conflict. So these practical examples really drive home how it's relevant. And so I'm going to sort of take the opportunity as a moderator to ask one question, and I'm very curious for everybody's perspectives on this. Thank you, Janet, for talking about Rwanda. It's an important post-conflict example because there's been a real emphasis on attention to gender and women's empowerment within the Rwandan context. I'm wondering, and I know you've looked at some of these issues as well. You talked about where we should be putting the invested dollar in a place like Rwanda post-conflict, and I'm wondering whether there's been any emerging literature about the emphasis from an economic perspective that Rwanda has placed on gender budgeting and what the implications of that have been for the peace-building trajectory or for gender equality in the country. So Rwanda has the highest female political participation in the world. How has the focus on gender budgeting either helped, assisted, buttressed the post-conflict process there, or the struggles for gender equality within the context of a poor post-conflict country? And I would welcome your thoughts and observations kind of carrying that case study forward.
Yeah, I can't really speak, but it's certainly a fascinating topic, especially because you're now accumulating about 20 years of post-conflict stability. So you're actually accumulating enough data to see that outcome. Yeah. Certainly in the case of where their priorities were in their gender budgeting program, it seemed to me they were certainly focused on education, equalizing educational opportunities of girls, especially at the secondary level and in the science area. So it seemed to me they were trying to do what made sense in an economic sense, even in whether it was post-conflict or not, what African countries need to do, which was focus on the secondary level, and then the post-secondary level, the scientific education, the more influential jobs in their system. From the dimension of politics, I can't speak as much. Also, so in terms of the feedback to infrastructure, I think that there seem to be, but I can't really speak on that. And some people have studied, for instance, India, where there's had more women's participation and whether it's led to changes in public spending. I think it would be fascinating, actually, to collect data on Rwanda and look at that influence and see whether the fact that they've had an effective gender budgeting, relatively effective gender budgeting, and this large women's role, whether it's actually had an influence on spending priorities. We actually asked the Rwandans whether they would be willing to share their data, but we haven't yet succeeded in getting the kind of unpublished data that we would need to do that. But I think it would be a fascinating research topic.
And do you think, and Carol, I'm sure you have comments on this as well, but do you think that their attention to gender budgeting has increased the stability within the country or has increased the development trajectory from an economic perspective in Rwanda?
I haven't done the kind of controlled analysis. Certainly they've had a very good development outcome economically. I'm not speaking of politically, but economically, yeah, they've been one of the best performers in Africa now for a sustained period of time, over this. And they're a resource-poor country. They're very densely populated. So the fact that they've been stable and growing rapidly says that they've done something right, which their neighbors, for instance, in the area and elsewhere haven't been able to achieve. But whether that's the gender or it's other influences, the fact that they just have a very stable situation compared to others politically, good or bad, it's been stable. So I haven't been able to do that, but I think that would be a great topic to look at it now. And that was one of the unrealized aspects of our project, doing more evaluation of the outcome. First was to identify the countries that had actually done well, and then was to actually evaluate them with data, because even though there's a pretty long record now of gender budgeting, there's been very little actual evaluation of these initiatives with data. The one we did with India is one of the only ones that actually used data from gender budgeting programs. But it's an area where if someone's interested in a research topic, I would encourage them to follow up, because I think there's a lot to be learned from that. And they're a good example.
That can be your next book, Tom. Carol?
So I want to answer you on a somewhat meta level. I think that one of the really interesting things that we need to think about here, first of all, is even what do we mean by gender equality, right? Because there are certain things that we always go to about access to education, access to health, and so on, and access to employment, and these things are obviously important. But if we're thinking about the Women, Peace, and Security agenda and thinking about gender equality, does it mean we have to think about, for example, the impact of militarization on a society? So not just, do women have equal access to participating in militaries, but does militarization in a society rely on and require certain kinds of ideas about masculinities and femininities having to do with, protection and so on, that are ultimately damaging for women? Or does militarization also lead to a set of, have implicit in it a set of ideologies about violence and force being effective means solve problems, and how does that filter down to, the woman who's going out onto the street and, or in the home, or so that, do we have to think about militarization when we think about gender equality, or do we have to think about environmental degradation? Do we have to think about how an extractive industry is, polluting the land that women do their subsistence farming on, or killing the fish in the lake that they're depending on for food? And, so I think that the things that are easy to measure economically, certainly, and that are typically related to a lot of kinds of development goals may not be the only. So I guess all I'm saying is I want to open it up and not just assume that we know what we mean when we say gender equality and what's going to actually promote it. I think it's probably bigger. And here, bringing gender equality and peace and security together becomes really interesting, because I don't know, we can't know whether gender equality leads to more peace, right? Because we don't actually have the data, right? I mean, this is not, but I have to say that, when I come to thinking about peace building in this way, my interest is in making sure that peace building doesn't continue to happen in ways that it often fails, but number two, that it deepens inequalities rather than transforming them, and I mean gendered and other inequalities in doing that. And so without making the causal argument, equality will lead to, I think it will lead to better peace building, but I don't think we actually can have the data on that. And then I think if you go from I think part of what's really interesting about gender budgeting is that this is, a tool by which you can say, okay, here's a series of objectives, let's actually have programs that try to meet them. If you say, what about gendered peace budgeting? What does peace add into gendered budgeting? And how does that transform, and what would peace budgeting be in the first place when you think about it as not just being about a certain model of stability, a certain model of economic development, but also something that actually dealt with some of these social inequalities? So I think that gender budgeting is a great example of a tool that we then have to try to transform for gendered peace budgeting and figure out what that means.
Your points are really interesting and important. I think one of the things when I was working on the gender equality agenda at USAID that came through was when we were doing work on women's labor force participation and trying to increase women's employment. The way those programs were carried out often had important implications for sexual and gender-based violence. So if you didn't create space within the society for men and women side by side without resentment, then you could have an unintended negative impact on domestic violence, particularly, and gender-based violence in homes and communities. And of course, we know that often women have a broader definition for what is security and what is peace. And so how they would feel in terms of how safe they are within their society if you have a rampant rise in domestic violence and gender-based violence would be an interesting question. And I think it gets to the issue you're raising, Carol, of what does peace mean to different populations within a society. So thank you for that. I'm going to open up. I could keep talking and asking questions, but I will not. I have plenty if we run out of others. To open up the floor because we have about 20 minutes left for a conversation. And what I would ask is two things. First, please make sure to turn on your microphone because we are webcasting this, and so if you're not using your microphone, they won't be able to hear your question. And the second is please give us your name and your affiliation before you pose your question. Madam.
Good morning. Can you hear me? Good morning. My name is Rosemary Seguero. I'm a president of a non-profit organization that focuses on conflicts and undercurrent that focus on manufacturing, innovation, and here in the U.S. and back in Africa. I'm from Kenya. Looking at the post-conflicts, we're talking about investing in women, as you just said, Rwanda. Rwanda has 61% of women in parliament. So with law, even if they passed, women will support because they are the majority. But we have other countries like South Sudan, like DRC, that have passed Syria and other countries where women want to develop. But because they have no voice and women have small, and these countries of conflicts have oil, have minerals, and this is why the war was. So they want to give women small businesses like for microfinance, sitting on that at home to do business, and that's why I focus on manufacturing and innovation, focusing on women. What can women do? Businesses in mining, in oil, so that they can also become like men. So how do we fight this? Because when you go to the government will tell you another story. Because when in Africa, civil society are considered to be spy. So we need a policy where civil society, public sector can collaborate. I was here in public global partnership last week on Monday. We're talking about partnership. How do these women, how do we partner? Invest into women to do the actual business, not microfinance business that can lift the economy, can lift them and the economy of the countries. How do we make this happen? With the government being partners with you, U.S. Institute of Peace, IMF. I attend IMF World Bank meetings. We are coming next week, and I thank Madam Lakat putting gender into IMF. So how do we make this collaboration to come and empower women in actual manner, not just being down there, but lift them to be, bigger businesses?
Great, thank you very much. Maybe we'll take a couple questions and then we'll circle back to the panel. So I think that's an excellent one.
I'm Ginny Bouvier from the U.S. Institute of Peace. Thank you so much for your presentations today, and thank you, Kathleen, for putting this together. I think it's a really important topic, particularly for those of us who are working in peace process issues and looking at post-conflict reconstruction and trying to figure out how to make sure that women are left better off after the war than they were during the war. I have a couple of quick questions. One, Janet, you talked about the lessons that you pulled from gender budgeting, being applied in many different situations. Two questions. First, I'm wondering if you have any sense of, you mentioned, I don't do politics, but I wonder if you would be able to chart out and do some sort of a study that linked the political participation of women in the countries that have gender budgeting to be able to see whether, in fact, where women are in power, we're getting different kinds of budgeting procedures that are more inclusive of gender. And the second part of it, I'm wondering if you have any lessons from not the gender budgeting itself, but the arrival of a mandate for gender budgeting. That is, how do you get to the point where you can have gender budgeting, where you have the unequal society and unequal political parties, or unequal representation in political forums that would discuss the gender budgeting? Secondly, I just wanted to comment, Carol, I appreciate your comment that all processes are gendered. I think this is increasingly important, and it also it's one of the ways to get to the gender budgeting by getting around the divisiveness, I think, of saying we're going to have this group look at women's issues, generally not gendered issues. In this group, look at the technical issues. So I think it's an important launching post for moving forward. And finally, Tom, your comment, budgets and contracts are everything. I couldn't say it more clearly, but I think the other question is the question of power. You know, who has power? Who has power to decide how budgets are allocated is really important, and where women are in those processes is even more important. And where gender-sensitive men are in those processes is really important. The women, as we've found, are not necessarily gender-sensitive. Oftentimes the ones that get into power are doing the same thing that everybody else has done to stay in power, and less concerned about gender interests. Thanks.
We'll take one more, and then we'll circle back.
Hi, my name is Ann Sweetser. I'm an anthropologist working as an independent consultant. I'm working on an idea here. Generally, things have gone past looking at women's issues to looking at this broader situation of women. But I don't hear much discussion about using gender budgeting or using this whole discourse to promote women's aid. I mean, in a project, you can easily have a poor woman fixing the faucets or being the one who reports up if there's some problem in the neighborhood, or having young women working in IT administering it, or in ADRA you have women who go out and other women are doing during the day and collect money from them and so on. But would it not make sense to somehow include in the implementation of a gendered budget funding to promote the engagement of women in decision-making at the local level, in monitoring, or in appropriate ways that don't assume women that are going to be engaged in any way are already at the level of being able to participate at the national government level or something, in order to spread around the possibility of enhancing women's empowerment, not just in the economic sense, but in terms of their own agency. Thank you.
Great, thank you. 3 great questions. Tom, do you want to speak a little bit to Kenya and the issues of resource extraction and manufacturing, and any ideas that have come from the research you've been working on recently?
I'll do one quick note on that, since USIP has shifted some towards looking more at resource scarcity, so that's something that we'll be going into more in the future. On the gender side, though, I think this is a really important point about types of industries and how they have their own underlying aspect to them. And one quick story is a voucher program for vocational training in Punjab, Pakistan, where they maybe adopted some lessons that instead of assigning people to certain programs, to give them a voucher and a list of choices. And the people looking at this program were still surprised to find that the men that received the voucher showed more pro-social behavior and were more likely to engage politically, and the women were less likely and showed less pro-social behavior. And the issue was that the menu that was given to the women, while they still had a choice, the menu was very unsatisfactory, that women saw the choices and saw this as the government devalues my work, and why should I engage with that kind of government. So I think that speaks to the importance of moving beyond maybe traditional female employment roles, and also speaks to the connection between the economics and the politics, and the need for good evaluation data all the way down on this process. Something that I really appreciate about Carol and Janet's presentation.
Sorry. Either the issue of women's agency in the budgeting process, or the connection between the gender budgeting and political participation.
Yeah, and also I'll just comment briefly on the first one, because although I didn't touch on the revenue side, wresting control of natural resource and natural resource producing countries from vested interests is a whole separate topic. But there is an important issue, is how much revenue the state gets from those. And that is an important issue. Our colleague Jim, who was in here but was part of Carol's workshop, talked about that. And the whole issue that this should be seen as a source of revenue for the state. And for instance, my work in the IMF on tax policy was very much engaged with trying to structure revenues from natural resources so that they accrue to the state, that they're not just exploited and for the benefit of multinationals and vested interests who own these things, which are often a small clique. But that some of that should be seen as benefiting women's programs, that this can be part of a gender budgeting initiative and can be used to stimulate, so that you stimulate from the ground up, but that you generate revenues from where they are. And natural resources for natural resource-rich countries are often the best resource handle. That's why it's interesting that a country like Rwanda can do so well, because it's not generating its revenues from natural resources. Or Kenya, a country that's really trying to generate its revenues from a diverse set of revenue sources, manufacturing, other things, which ultimately may be a strength for it, and you build itself up from a smaller level. On this issue of political participation, it's not that I don't think politics is important. I think absolutely having more women in government will make a difference. It's just that's something we didn't study and the problem is, in a lot of developing countries, looking at women's participation in parliament may be a very imperfect indicator of their real role, because they have very strong presidential systems, and so I didn't want to get into all of that. So, and you would have to really study each country, because each country may be different. But how much women's majority in Rwandan parliament has in terms of real influence will be different there than, let's say, in a country like the U.S., where, let's say, the Congress has, more power to actually enact a budget. So there's a difference in terms of the role that parliamentarians or, members of Congress will have in a country where the executive and legislative branches have a different relationship. So it's hard to say. But as I said, there is an interesting study from India where quotas that were imposed in empowering more women through quotas were shown to affect public budgeting in ways that were seen to reflect the interests that women had in infrastructure and other areas where clearly they had a different set of priorities. And not only was that interesting study, it showed that men's bias against having women politicians changed. After seeing women in power, they were less biased against having women once they saw that women in power could be competent. So there is a literature on that. I'm not saying it's not important. It's just not something we tried to tackle in our project, because we tried to stay focused on the economic issues. But I definitely think it has an effect. There's no question. Looking at the European experience, you can see that. As far as the question of the gender budgeting mandate, absolutely putting it into law, I think, is essential for making ministries of finance take these things seriously. They have to obey their laws. So if you really want gender-related objectives and to be taken seriously in the budget process, it should be part of, like Austria and Rwanda did, put it into their organic budget laws. But it's not sufficient, as we saw from the experience of Europe, where a number of European countries, quite a few of them, actually have these things in their law, and they still don't actually do very much. It's basically ignored. So you have to actually have the interest in not just the law, but the law is a good starting point. And in terms of the point on agency, yes, I think it's very important to have engagement of women at local level. Of course, the starting point of agency is having educated women. So that's an important part of gender budgeting, is enabling women to be able to represent themselves effectively, and certainly having education is a good part of that. But that's also the importance of having gender budgeting filter through to every level of government, so that you enable them at the local level to higher levels, just as as you could see, for instance, in the process that was at work even in this country, where women's participation rose in certain levels of government, and then they were able to represent themselves at higher levels. You could try that same process in countries like what the Indian experiment was doing, trying to empower women at local levels, at the village level, with an idea that this would then filter upwards to higher levels of government. So I do think that's an important part of the process and can be built into gender budgeting initiatives.
So just to start for a minute from where Janet was talking about control of natural resources and the possibility of wresting those revenues to the state, and then what do you do with them? This, again, the idea, Jim Boyce talked a lot about sovereign wealth funds, and you can use sovereign wealth funds to say, I'm going to fund, gender equality programs or something like that. You can also say, I'm going to use as part of a sovereign wealth fund to have a guaranteed minimum income for every man and woman in the country separately, and that, that itself probably has some important implications for women's agency. But I think that the part of where I want to go with this is to say that when we talk about sovereign wealth funds and control of the revenues from natural resource extraction, we're talking about how you spend the money rather than how you do the gendered impact analysis of how we're extracting the resources in the first place, okay? And so, and that's what I think the feminist roadmap is about. So it is important, for example, for women to have opportunities to not just have the, the small microeconomic stuff, but also the larger. But it's also important, if the woman runs the mine or the, oil drilling in the same way that the man does, that woman will get rich, but it will be very destructive to many other people. So the whole question of how you do gendered impact analyses of these large processes in advance, right? We need to know some things about these in advance because they happen quickly at the end of an armed conflict. And of course, they're going to be, different from place to place, but part of what's really interesting is if we think about this feminist roadmap to sustainable peace as providing some gendered impact analytic tools, and the way gender budgeting could be a tool where you say, here's the objective, how do we make sure that our money goes to it? This would sort of almost coming to it from the opposite end and say, happen now. What are the gendered impacts analysis? If we transform it in these ways, will it have the gendered impacts we want, or will it actually have some other ones, right? And how do we do the thinking and analysis of that, a significant part of that prior to peace processes, prior to those decisions about post-conflict reconstruction? Because if you don't, the only logic that will determine how those things happen is the logics that have already been determining how they happen, and the expertise that has already been determining how that happens.
Thank you. The one thing I would add also is there are some issues policy and the budgetary process, but there are a lot of issues that are not related to that. So if we're talking about sort of the rents or the ability to take advantage of natural resources in a country, a lot of it is the rulemaking around how those licenses are led and the rights are handled, and some of that gets as far to micro decisions as when and where are the meetings held and where are they posted when they're talking about how you're allocating those rights, and can women get there, and is it in a time and a place where they're able to go, and how do you structure and monitor that process to enable them to have a voice in decision making and gain economic influence. Let's take a final couple of questions and then we'll give our panelists the response and the last word. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Barbara Svedberg from the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. Thank you, panelists, for your presentations. I wanted to ask a question to Janet in particular, and linking it a bit to what Carol was talking about, the transformative potential post-conflict and how it's linked to budget processes. And my specific question related to gender budgeting, is there a way, or have you seen in your project a link to the national action plans on women, peace and security? So to that the national budget process and gender budgeting need to be informed by the gender goals and the women's sort of agenda. And if we look at it in not only a post-conflict context, but also in context where governments are concerned with the women, peace and security agenda also in the development policies, are they bringing that inwards to their national processes? So to be have you seen any cases or links between the women, peace and security goals that has been approved by the government and a gender budgeting process? And if so, or if not, do you see a potential for those two agendas to be linked? Thank you.
I'm Vipada from IMF. My question is, this topic is about after gender equality needs an investment. Gender equality need investment too. And one of the discussion is about the data, information of the data. I think there's a significant role that we don't have to wait until we have war and peace. The gender issue, the information and development issue actually should be used in order to prevent conflict in the first place. So this is something that they're going to get into the conflict. They better know what they are talking about. This is where sharing of information is very, very critical. Thank you.
Take a final question and then give you each an opportunity to answer the question and give any final comments.
My name is Simin, and I am from Afghanistan, and I would like to share some of my experiences working in Afghanistan. So I work with big donors like USAID, and my experience. So when I work with these donors, I believe that most of these projects are not structured to focus on gender equality in a way that is more effective, especially in Afghanistan or societies like Afghanistan. So the projects are either solely focused on women, or there are no gender sensitive measures in the project. So few examples. I work with one of the biggest projects that focus on 4 major universities in Afghanistan. I work as a gender advisor for that project, and I didn't really have, so the gender advisor position itself limits the how far you can go as a gender advisor. So you can only give advice. If they take it, they take it. If they don't, it's okay. And the argument was that it's not a gender project, but it's a higher education project. So I wonder, how do we redefine gender to make sure that every project that we implement in Afghanistan is gender sensitive? It shouldn't be just the health projects or the maternity projects or the handicraft projects. So every project, from security, safety to construction and infrastructure, should be gender sensitive. And the donors have power. They can do that. I know that the government are not very supportive of gender. That's why we have gender issues in Afghanistan. But if the donors come with those indicators or with those measures and make it mandatory for every project, I'm sure that it will be more effective in Afghanistan and other countries like Afghanistan. Thank you.
Perfect, thanks. We'll go down the line. Carol.
Yes, absolutely. So I think that what we have come to here is something very important about the relationship between 2 things. One of them is power, and the other is the capacity to actually do substantial gender analysis rather than simply say a women's issue or a women's project. And I think that, one of the issues is, as Ginny pointed out, having women someplace doesn't mean that they're necessarily interested in that gender analysis or in gender equality. It is incredibly important to have, however, so there are many different places, I think, where if we're really interested in transformative peace building, people can have impacts. You want to have feminist women or men in positions of power to be making those decisions, but you also need analysis so that when they make those decisions, they can actually make them in a way that is transformative, okay? So that it's not just saying women get this project or women get this position of power, but this is how we do resource extraction differently, or this is how we do agricultural policy differently. So you need that kind of analysis, and not just to assume that if somebody's in favor of gender equality, they'll get it right. Who needs that power? Well, part of what you're pointing to, of course, is that the donors have a lot of power. There are people throughout these processes that have a lot of power. It's not just about having a woman president or a woman in the parliament or even a woman a feminist woman at the peace table, right? And that's another part of what we're really interested in the roadmap. Try to map who where are all the places where somebody could, we call it critical levers for change, right? Where you could actually, and donors have a lot of capacity to do that. Third parties in peace negotiations have a lot of capacity to do that. Women's movements have a lot of capacity to do that. So how do we identify those things? So you're asking exactly the right questions.
I do feel compelled. Analysis is mandatory for every project in USAID and has been for several years. So the question is more than just putting those mandates in place. And this is true from many donors now. It's about how those analyses are applied, the extent to which they're enforced, whether the monitoring evaluation system builds that up. But I think we need to look to something other than just the mandate.
Can I just add one thing on it? Cynthia Enlow says this great thing in the beginning of the book where she says, liking women or thinking gender equality is good is not the same as being able to do gender analysis. And technical capacity and training around actually sophisticated gender analysis is another thing that people could be doing.
Thanks. Tom.
So the question about shouldn't we be doing this all the time, not just post-conflict, I think that's absolutely right. I think this panel took this one perspective, and I think there are some unique opportunities in the post-conflict setting that there's actually one on the literature table out there. Kathleen co-wrote an article with Nora Dudwick on gender and fragility, ensuring a golden hour. That's fantastic at kind of laying out those dynamics and how to think about that. So I would highly recommend that article.
Great, thank you. Janet.
Yeah, I'll just comment on the Afghan case. For instance, you might find the Middle East and Central Asia paper interesting because Afghan was one of the two countries we highlighted, Morocco and Afghanistan. All we could find was that the gender budgeting initiative had survived because of the donors. That was our conclusion, that they had pushed it as much as they could. It wasn't clear to us that it would have survived in the absence, as Carla was saying. So it would be nice to see that had taken hold in an indigenous way, but it wasn't clear to us. So it was one of the countries in that region that stood out for having a reasonably effective gender budgeting initiative. We had been integrated, at least at the national level, into various important programs. But it wasn't clear to us without all of the donor money and requirements whether it would have been sustained. So that was our only question in calling it a prominent initiative, because that wasn't the case, for instance, in Morocco, where it seemed to be more homegrown and accepted by the Ministry of Finance and the agent and other parts of government. On Barbara's comment, I think I haven't ever actually seen a gender budgeting initiative that tried to take into account the women, peace, and security. I mean, I think it's a really fascinating point you're making, that in some sense the gender budgeting initiatives, they go to national development plans, because most of the people who work on this are economists and sometimes political scientists. And so they go to things that are directly linked to economics. There just hasn't been that much of a, but that would be a great thing to bring into account, that it's both the governments themselves who need to do this. They need to bring the women, peace, and security into their own national development plans. And then the gender budgeting, which is taking those plans and putting it into the budget. So it's both the government that has to integrate it into its own planning, because the budget has to reflect the government's own priorities, right? So the government has to integrate those things, but then the budget should be aware of those things, and if there's a discrepancy between those things, to reconcile all of these things. But I think that's a really important point. I mean, that's what I think Carol is trying to accomplish with this whole project, is to bring together this whole idea and to say that these things aren't one and the same, and that they should, like just the example you were giving, I mean, is a perfect example where, demining the roads, because you think you have to get transportation, but forgetting that women play the predominant role in agriculture and, will be maimed and killed because the mines will still be in the agricultural sector. Then you have to have a budgetary program that will spend money on demining the fields as opposed to just demining the roads. And a gender perspective on that, looking at the different roles that men and women play in the society, that's absolutely the idea of gender budgeting. I mean, that's a perfect example in a post-conflict case where the different objectives of the government, from an economic development, a peace and security, and a gender budgeting, come together in a nice way to serve the objectives of the society. Not just women or men, but that society. So that's really a great example.
Perfect. Well, thank you all for staying a few minutes over, and please join me in thanking our panelists and Kathleen and Danielle for organizing the event. And as Kathleen pointed out, we have a series of events this month for National Women's History Month, and we hope we'll welcome you back again for the next in that series. Thank you so much.